Occasionally, the faintest sounds possess the loudest secrets. It all started with a bark. James initially thought nothing of it. Dogs bark. They are barkers. That's what they do. But the trouble was, Max wouldn't stop barking. Not at the mailman, not at the neighbor's cat, but at the basement door. Still, James figured that he had moved into the worn Victorian on Elm Street for a reason. The stars seemed to align every once in a while, after all. And with a rough year behind him, he could afford to simply start fresh. The house was old, with creaking floorboards, blinking lights, and an unsettling draft that went through the halls. But he wasn't prepared for Max's sudden obsession with the basement. Day after day, like clockwork, sitting by the basement door, his ears perked up, body tense, Max would bark relentlessly. The hollow vibrations boomed through the empty corridors, sending goosebumps up James' arms. "Come on, Max," James said under his breath, getting down on one knee to his golden retriever. "There's nothing down there." But Max didn't budge. He kept his eyes fixed upon the door, unblinking, as if some sound from the other side were beckoning him. James sighed, raking his hand through his hair. He had searched the basement a dozen times. He had only found old furniture, a few cobwebs, and an ancient furnace. Nothing sinister. Nothing that would require such a reaction from Max. But deep down, James couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. Over time, Max's behavior became increasingly erratic. He wouldn't eat. He paced near the door, tail low. James saw that the hair on Max's back would bristle as he gave a low growl, his demeanor changing from curious to wary. One night, following yet another round of round-the-clock barking, James had had enough. He took a flashlight and slowly opened the basement door. "See, nothing there," he murmured, flicking the switch. The dim light flickered on, casting eerie shadows through the room. Max froze at the top of the stairs, his tail stiff. James descended, his feet sounding alone in the cavernous void. Boxes lay strewn about, coated in years of dust. He searched every inch, hoping for some clue as to what was bothering Max. Then he saw it. In the dimmest corner of the basement, under a tattered tarp, something glinted. His heart beating faster, he took steps closer. When he pulled back the tarp, a chill ran down his spine. Beneath that cover was an ancient rusty safe. James took a shaky breath. "What is this doing here?" Max started whimpering from the top of the stairs, his eyes fixed on the safe. James had curiosity burning in him, but part of him also didn't want to raise a fuss. There was something about this discovery that seemed wrong. But James, which stared at the safe for what seemed like hours, his mind flooded with possibilities. Was it something that was left by the previous owners? Or was it something more ancient, something lost? So he decided to leave it the night. But as he locked up and attempted to sleep, he kept returning to the safe. Max, who was curled up at the foot of his bed, whimpered in his sleep, twitching in his dreams. James could no longer look past it. Inside that safe was something waiting to be found. And tomorrow, he would learn what it was. It is curiosity that can unlock doors we never even knew were there. James woke up and could not get his mind off the safe in the basement. Morning sunlight shone through the curtains, but the heaviness in his chest made it difficult to appreciate a new day's warmth. Max sat at the foot of the bed, staring at him with those same concerned eyes. "Okay, buddy," James said, rubbing his temples. "Let's find out what's so special with that safe." James descended the creaky basement stairs with a large cup of strong coffee in hand, Max carefully trailing behind. Dust hummed in the air, reeking of old wood and metal in his nose. He yanked the tarp off the safe again, trailing his fingers across the pocked metal surface. The dial was rusted, the numbers almost illegible. James inhaled and twisted it. To his surprise, the dial turned with a low groan, as if it hadn't been turned in decades. "Nothing ventured, nothing gained," he muttered, trying a number of random combinations. Nothing. Max growled a low growl and put his ears back. The fur on his neck stood on end. "Easy, Max," James said to him. But inside he, too, felt the same knot of discomfort. For some reason, this safe didn't feel right. James understood he needed help after trying unsuccessfully multiple times. He picked up his phone and called his old friend Mark, who was in home renovations. "Hey, Mark, it's James. Listen, I discovered this old safe in my basement and I wanted to know if you could come check it out." "A safe? In that old house of yours? Sounds interesting." "I'll come over this afternoon," Mark replied. James ended the call and turned towards Max. "It appears we'll have some company, bud." The day passed slowly, and James could not think about anything else. He wondered every time the house creaked. He continued to go back to the basement, standing in front of the safe, gazing at it as though it might open by itself. When Mark finally showed up, he had a toolbox and an air of curiosity. "Okay, let's take a look at this mystery safe of yours." Standing in the dark basement, Mark inspected the safe closely. "Looks old, perhaps dating from the 1940s or before. Do you have any idea who lived here before?" James shook his head. "No clue. I just heard the house was empty for years." Mark frowned. "Well, let's give it a shot." He began to turn the dial, his hands expert at the task, listening for the clicks and the vibrations. Click after click after click after click. James stopped breathing as Mark pulled away. "All right, it's open. Ready to see what's inside?" James gulped and nodded his head. He opened the safe door slowly. Nestled amid soot and antiquated paperwork were piles of ancient paperwork, a handful of faded images, and a small metallic box with a complex lock. James waved away dust and picked up a photo. It was a photo of a man and a dog that bore a striking resemblance to Max. "What the?" James whispered, with his pulse pounding. Max emitted a quiet whine, his nose flaring as if he knew too. Mark looked back over his shoulder. "Looks like you guys have more than just an old house, James. You've got a story. Some secrets never stay buried." Sat down on the cold floor of the basement, legs crossed, sorting the old documents. Each paper seemed delicate, like it would shatter if he touched it. Sitting beside him, Max stared at the photo of the man and the dog that looked so much like the one just behind them. "This guy looks like you, buddy," James murmured, raising the faded photo. Mark propped himself against the workbench and examined the contents of the safe. "So, what do we have here? Old financial records, a handful of personal letters. And what's behind that little metal box?" James hesitated. The ornate lock on the small box appeared to be made of sturdy metal, even in its old condition. He rotated it, holding the weight of whatever was inside. "I guess I need to get this opened carefully. It may be something of value." Mark shrugged. "Or it could simply be an old coin stash. In any case, you've got yourself a real-life mystery." So James decided to begin with the letters. He opened the first one gingerly, its paper too thin and brittle under his fingers. The writing was neat but shaky. "To whomever should find this, I want you to know that everything I did for love, for family. If you are reading this, I am gone, and my great regret is never having been able to tell my story in full." James and Mark exchanged a glance. "What does that mean?" Mark shrugged. Someone must have had a secret. Keep reading. James went on, his tone even. There are things hidden in this house, things that were meant to protect what I held dear. There are the answers, where the heart beats at peace. James furrowed his brow, his mind spinning. Where the heart finds rest. Could that possibly mean the bedroom, the living room? Max whined lightly, then stood up, his tail wagging tentatively as he padded toward the basement door. I think Max knows something that we don't, Mark said, folds his arms. Max had gone upstairs, and James followed with Mark behind him. There was purpose in the dog, his nose low as he edged through the old house. They entered the living room, and Max halted in front of the hearth. James bent down, his fingers tracing the worn bricks. Could this be it? Mark knocked on the bricks to see if any sounded hollow. After a moment, his knuckles tapped against one that sounded different. Here, Mark said, pointing. Try removing it. Slowly, James extracted the loosened brick, revealing a small compartment. Within, a parcel wrapped in an old silk cloth. As he slowly unwrapped it, James gasped. It was a series of black and white photographs, the man from that earlier picture with the same golden retriever, except this time they were posed in front of a much newer version of the house. There's more history here than I realized, James whispered. James felt an odd sense of kinship as he held the photos. Who was this man? And why had Max been so fascinated by the basement? Mark nudged him. I feel like it's time to find out what's in that little metal box. James nodded. Yeah, it could be the answer to everything. Preparing to open the box, James marveled at how whatever lay inside would surely unlock the mystery of the house, and maybe even the odd behavior of Max. Certain mysteries lie in plain sight, waiting to be unmasked at just the right time. James sat at the kitchen table, the small metal box turned toward him and Mark. They opened the photographs they had found on their computer, TJA images telling them stories of time long ago. Max sat at the base of James's feet, his ears twitching each time James's fingers grazed the box. Okay, Mark said, lightly rapping the table. Are we going to open it or just look at it all night? James let out a sigh, dragging his hand across his hair in frustration. I have this weird feeling, like whatever's in here could change everything. Mark smirked. Only one way to find out. Spielberg. In the first box, James took a deep breath. With deliberate hands, he scrutinized the lock again. It was old, but well made, and lacking a key, their options were few. Allow me to try something, said Mark, pulling a small set of lock-picking tools from his jacket pocket. James raised an eyebrow. Why do you even have those? Mark grinned. Let's just say I have an interesting past. After a series of tense minutes clicking and adjusting, the lock clicked open. James and Mark exchanged a nervous look as James slowly raised the lid. Inside, swaddled in a scrap of velvet cloth, lay an old leather-bound journal. James gently opened it, its pages dense with faded ink. Delicate handwriting coursed across each. It's his journal, James muttered, skimming the pages. The man in the photos. Max whimpered softly, as if he understood the gravity of it. James read aloud. March 12th, 1954. I met him by the river today, and he was wandering. He was cold, hungry, and scared, but in his eyes, he had something in his eyes, something that told me he was meant to be here. I named him Max. James held his breath in his throat. Max. He is named after this dog. Mark leaned closer. Keep reading. August 8th, 1956. I am afraid someone knows what I have hidden here. They've been watching the house, prowling at night. Max has been restless, detecting danger before I do." James turned to look at Mark, heart pounding. What did he hide? In thumbing through the pages, James found mentions of something called the ledger. It contained names, transactions, and secrets the previous owner had been keeping, something he valued enough to hide, according to the journal. "The ledger," James murmured. "It must be here somewhere." Mark got up and started to walk around the room. That's why Max was so obsessed with the basement. He must have sensed something related to it. James knelt, brushing his hand across the dog-eared pages. "We need to find it." Just then, Max got to his feet and padded toward the basement door, glancing back at James hopefully. James exhaled deeply. Seems he wants to give us a look. Flashlights and determination in hand, James and Mark trailed Max inside the creaky basement stairs. The room was quiet, save for the steady plink of a leaky pipe in the corner. James looked around and turned on the flashlight. Where do we even start? Max padded over to the old shelving unit, sniffing the floorboards beneath. "Help me move this," James said. After a bit of tugging, the shelf screeched across the floor and the boards beneath opened up to reveal a hidden compartment. Mark whistled. "Bingo?" James opened the wooden panel to reveal a small, locked metal box, clogged with dirt and dust from the webbing. "This has to be it," James said as he gripped the box tightly. Max sat next to him, his tail just slightly wagging. James looked at Mark. "Are you ready to find out what's inside? Some secrets run deep, but they always come to the surface." James brushed dirt off of the small metal box they had found in the basement. His hands shook just a little, an excitement growing in his chest. Mark had an old-school flashlight, the kind that sometimes had yellow light, and it lit up the box. Max sat wordlessly, staring at the box, as though he too knew this was something important. "Okay," James mumbled, swallowing hard. "Let's see what we've got." He turned it and pried it open, and the lid creaked against the metal. Inside, swaddled in fragile yellowed cloth, was an old leather-bound book with the initials HT, embossed in faded gold metallic letters on the cover. "HT?" Mark asked, leaning closer. James opened the book, his heart racing. Inside, neat but rushed writing filled the pages. Names, dates, dollar amounts, all carefully entered into the ledger. "It's a ledger," James said, whispering, "a record of something important." Mark furrowed his brow. "But what sort of records are they? They don't resemble typical transactions." James turned deeper into the book, eyes raking down the lines until he came to a familiar name. Thompson and Company. Estates, $10,000. 1956. "Wait," James said softly. "Thompson and Company. That's the company that originally built this house." Mark's eyes widened. "You think this is some sort of financial conspiracy?" James was sitting on the floor of the basement, surrounded by scattered documents. He kept turning the pages, drawing connections that had gone unnoticed for decades. There were notes scrawled in the margins, redirected funds to a different account, keep away from inquiry. He shook his head. Whoever kept this ledger was obviously covering something up. Maybe embezzlement, fraud. Mark nodded. May explain why the safe was so well hidden. Someone didn't want this to get discovered. Max let out a plaintive whimper and shifted nervously. James groaned, glancing at the dog. "What's up, buddy? You okay?" Max's ears immediately perked up and he gave a brief but loud bark before trotting over to the corner of the basement and breathing in deeply. Mark stood up. "You think there's more?" Grabbing his flashlight, James followed Max's example, sweeping the light across the dark corners of the basement. His heart raced when he spotted a piece of the wall where the bricks seemed to be arranged differently. "Help me with this," he said. They pried together at the bricks until one finally gave, exposing a small compartment behind it. Inside the compartment was an envelope, brittle with time. James opened it with caution to find a letter and small key inside. He read aloud, "If you're reading this, it means I didn't finish what I started. The truth is more profound than what's in the ledger. Use the key, find the rest. Don't trust anyone." James and Mark exchanged a tense look. "Where does this key go?" Mark asked. James inspected it closely. It was an old brass key, tarnished, but still solid. His mind sprinted through the options. Maybe it's another safe, or some sort of hidden area in the house. This time, Max barked again, much urgently. James clenched his jaw. "I feel like we're just getting started. The doors are sometimes meant to be opened, but the truth is not all of them are easy to face." The old brass key sat heavily between James' fingers, its weight a jettisoned piece of history pressed to his palm. Mark, standing by in silence, was left to contemplate what their latest finding might mean. Max wandered, nails clicking against the cold basement floor. Something big. Every fiber of James' being told him was about to happen. "Time to inspect the rest of the house," James said through gritted teeth, his voice calm but his demeanor rooted in anxiety. "If this key fits anything here, we've got to find it." Mark nodded, and they both ascended the garage stairs and emerged from the dusty remnants of secrets long put to rest. They began in the living room, searching through dusty cabinets, dusty bookshelves, and even under the floorboards. James started finding his way as he slowly tested the changer in different locks. It would not turn each time. "Nothing," James sighed frustratedly, raking a hand through his hair. "We need to think like the individual who concealed all of this. Where would they stash something of value?" Max suddenly trotted toward the staircase to the second floor, pausing to look back at them expectantly. Mark followed Max's lead. "Seems like he's on to something again." James paused, gazing up the lackluster stairs. The upstairs portion of the home had always made him feel uneasy, like he was being watched from the gloom. "Let's check the attic," James said, his voice a near whisper. It was dark in the attic and smelled of dust and long-remembered time. Cobwebs clung to the beams, and dust twirled in the dim moonlight that came in through a small window. Max snuffled around the dusty trunks and crates, his tail wagging a little as he found an old wooden chest sitting in the corner. James dropped to his knees, clearing away years of dust and grime. He placed the key in the lock and turned it, holding his breath. Click. The lid of the chest creaked open, revealing what was inside. A pile of neatly folded letters, a leather-bound journal, and a small velvet pouch. James took the pouch and carefully opened it and poured out its contents into his hand. A thin gold locket slipped out, glinting in the light. He opened the locket and saw a black and white photo inside. A woman with soft eyes and a gentle smile, holding a young boy in her arms. James felt his chest tighten. Surely this had to mean something to him. Mark flipped through the journal, his brow knit. "James, listen to this. If they ever find out, it will all be for nothing. All I pray is it remains obscured until its way reaches suitable hands." James swallowed hard. I guess we just learned what they were trying to cover up. It was becoming more apparent as they read the letters and journal entries that the previous homeowner had discovered some serious financial shenanigans surrounding the Thompson estate. The ledger and these documents revealed a story of betrayal, devastated fortunes, and a frantic effort to hide the truth from powerful figures. James sighed, resting against the attic wall. This is larger than we imagined. Someone didn't want this getting out. Max nudged James' hand, anchoring him in the moment, and Mark arose, a resolve in his eyes. "What are you going to do with all this?" James exhaled slowly. "We determine who has a right to know the truth. Some truths, once revealed, can never be covered up." James plopped onto the attic floor, his eyes fixed on the open locket in his palm. The woman's face was eerily familiar, but he couldn't recall where he had seen her before. As Mark sat next to him, he was flipping through the pages of the journal they found. "James, hear this entry," exclaimed Mark. "June 17th, 1957. I fear they are closing in. I have heard whispers around town, and Max keeps barking at the basement door. Should anything happen to me, I pray whoever finds this knows what to do. The truth needs to come out." James started and gripped the locket tightly. Whoever wrote this knew that they were in danger. And Max, old Max, he knew as well. Max, the contemporary golden retriever, paced nervously, his nails clicking on the wooden floorboards. He also prowled around the attic, as if still looking for something that has not yet been found. "We have to find out who this woman is," James said as he held the photograph. "She might have answers." The following morning, James and Mark drove into town. Destination, the Maplewood Historical Archives. The old building had the odor of aging paper and history held in dust-covered books. They were met by a genial archivist named Mrs. Patterson. "How can I assist you, gentlemen?" she said, fixing her reading glasses. James put the locket on the counter. "We're trying to find out who this woman is. We suspect she may be linked to the old Thompson estate." Mrs. Patterson examined the photo closely. "This appears to be Eleanor Thompson, Harold Thompson's wife. She disappeared in the late 50s under mysterious circumstances." James and Mark exchanged a glance. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" Mrs. Patterson took out a yellowed newspaper clipping, gently opening it. The headline read, "Businessman's wife vanishes without a trace." Her last sighting was near the Thompson estate, but no sign of her was ever recovered. Mrs. Patterson continued. "For years there were rumors, but nothing definitive ever came out." James felt his pulse quicken. "And no one ever followed up?" Mrs. Patterson was shaking her head. The Thompson family had clout. The case quietly faded away. Back at the house, James and Mark examined their findings. James lay out the documents on the kitchen table, his mind racing. If Eleanor's body wasn't washed ashore, and this journal suggests a cover-up, and then someone in the family had something to hide, James said. Mark nodded. And whatever they were hiding might still be here. Max barked loudly as he stared at the wall of the living room. James scowled, crossing to where the dog stood. His hand skimmed the wall and felt a slight ridge. "Mark, help me push this bookshelf." Then they stood by side as they slid the heavy bookshelf out of the way to disclose a weather-worn door, chipped paint so old it began to flake. James took a deep breath. "This is getting weirder and weirder." He turned the handle and slowly opened the door, revealing a passageway that went into the dark with trembling hands. The answers we are looking for sometimes lie in the shadows. One step, lights still dim, mustering the courage to take the plunge. Mark trailed behind, holding a flashlight that cast ominous shadows on the damp, narrow walls. Max lingered at the entrance, ears pulled back and tail low. "It's okay, buddy," James said, soft as it gets, stroking Max's head. "We're going to work this out together." Deeper into the hidden passage they went, the air around them becoming ice cold, a musty scent lingering in the air from the time the bones were still in flesh. The beams in the walls felt too close even, that the house itself was monitoring them as they stepped around it. Who would have built this? And Mark said, his voice carrying a little. James shook his head. Whoever it was, there was something to hide. Several suspenseful moments of silence later, they reached the end of the passage. They were confronted with a thick wooden door holding iron bars. James gulped and reached for the handle. Michaela pushed the door open, revealing a small hidden room. The wooden desk that sat in the middle of the room, covered in dust and assorted papers. Against the wall, shelves of dusty books and rusty metal boxes reached to the ceiling. Mark took a step forward, waving his flashlight over the desk. "Look at this. Correspondence, documents, and photos." James picked up a photo, the air catching in his throat. The answer was Eleanor Thompson, next to the exact same golden retriever in the old photo that they had discovered earlier. "It's her," James whispered. "And look, there's Max. But how is that possible?" Opening and riffling through the documents, Mark's demeanor turned somber. "James, this is a letter from Eleanor. She was planning to leave. She knew something. And she was afraid." James read over his shoulder. "Harold is hiding something. I can't stay here any longer. If you read this, just know I tried to do the right thing." His stomach churned. What did she find? And what happened to her? While rummaging through the room, James noticed that in the corner was a small metal lockbox. He lifted it gently, feeling its heft in his hands. He gave him a rusty brass key they had found earlier. "Think it fits?" Mark asked. James inhaled heavily and put in the key. The box unlocked with a soft click. Inside, a pile of receipts, official documents, and another journal. James thumbed through the ledger, his eyes so wide they were practically gaping. "This proves it. Fraud, embezzlement. Harold confessed siphoning money, and Eleanor found out. She must have stashed these here, but why didn't she get away?" Max growled low as his eyes fixated on the doorway. Staring at James, Mark made eye contact. "I think that somebody didn't want her to leave." Suddenly, there was a sound from the passage behind them. Footsteps. James's heart raced. "We need to go. Now!" Mark swiftly collected the documents and shoved them into his backpack. James took Max's leash, and they sprinted out of the hidden room, backtracking through the tight passageway. Dean figured he'd require a year-long bath after this, reminded of the time he and Jim discovered a door under the stairs in the kitchen of the house Jim grew up in. All manner of things crawled out from behind the door, and when they came back into the house, Jim slammed it shut and gasped in heavy breaths. He leaned his back against it, listening. Silence. Mark wiped his forehead. "Somebody else knows about this, James. We are not the only ones who are excavating." James gave a grim nod, his jaw tangling in determination. "And then we need to learn the whole truth before they do." Max rubbed up against James, his doe-like eyes burning with trust and loyalty. "The closer you get to the truth, the more dangerous it is." James spread the documents they had retrieved from the hidden room across the table at the kitchen. As if anyone was going to show up, he stood by the window, peering through the glass, surveying the street. Max rested at James's feet, his ears twitching at every sound. The atmosphere was palpable, and James was surprised that his heart wasn't typewriter printing on his ribs. "Okay," James breathed, running fingers through his hair. "Now listen, let's be careful here. We've got to decipher what Eleanor was trying to tell us." Mark nodded and sat down next to him. These ledgers reflect a series of unapproved transfers, funds flowing out of Thompson and Company into overseas accounts. This is serious. He rifled through Eleanor's journal again, his fingers stopping on a page with a poorly written message. "I know what Harold did. He won't let me leave. If I should happen to die, the truth is in the safe." James stared up at him, his eyes blackening. She was never able to depart. "We have to figure out what happened to her." While they were still trying to piece the puzzle together, a sharp knock on the door made both of them freeze. Max growled softly, standing up with ears perked. James shot a glance at Mark. "Are you expecting anyone?" Mark shook his head silently. James rose and walked to the door. Peering through the peephole, he spotted an older man wearing a shabby coat, fidgeting nervously on the porch. With a deep breath, James cracked open the door. "Can I help you?" The man's gaze flitted past James, catching sight of the papers on the table. "I believe you already know who I am. I was Eleanor's brother, and I need to talk." James thumbed at the door, harder. "Come in." Eleanor's brother Richard sat on the couch, shaking with the old photograph of his sister in both hands. "She knew too much," he started, his voice uneven with emotion. "Harold was into stuff nobody could even think of. She tried to warn me, but I was too terrified to hear. I didn't think he'd—" His eyes glimmered, trailed off with regret. James leaned forward. "What happened to her?" Richard sighed heavily. "One night, she called me, panicking, claimed she had evidence and was leaving for good, but then she vanished. Harold told everyone she left him, but I knew differently. I could never prove it." James glanced at Mark. "We found her letters, her journal. She was scared." Richard nodded. "And now you've provoked something. If you've discovered that ledger, you're at risk. Harold had people who had his back. Some may still be watching." There was a chill coiling at the base of James's spine. "What do we do now?" Richard rising, his eyes full of sadness and urgency. "You complete what Eleanor began. You expose him." James nodded slowly. "We will, but we have to be careful." Richard put his hand on James's shoulder. "Just promise you won't let her story go away." James nodded, resolve hardening in his chest. "I promise." He caught hold of Mark as Richard exited. "We have everything we need. Now, we just have to learn how to implement it." Mark nodded. "And watch our backs." Max sat beside them in quiet protection in their search for the truth. There's a lot of power in the truth, but only if it's turned loose in the right manner. James settled at the kitchen table, tracing fingers along the edges of her journal. Mark paced near the window, his eyes darting out of the street anxiously. Richard's warning loomed thick in the air. "We can't throw all of this out on the internet," James said, looking at the pile of evidence laid out before them. "If Harold has any contacts, he'll shut it down before it gets this far." Mark nodded. "We need a plan, something airtight, something undeniable." Max sat in between them, watching them intently, as if he could hear the sincerity in their words. "I think we need to go to the local news station," James said. "The reach they'll have. And with the right journalist, we can make sure this gets out before anyone is able to bury it." Mark crossed his arms. "Do you have someone we can trust?" After thinking about it for a moment, James said, "Yes, yeah, Emily Carter. She now works bigger things before she used to work with me at the Gazette. Good if anyone can break this story, it's her." The following day, James placed the call. "Emily, it's James Carter. I need your help. It's concerning the old Thompson estate." Emily paused before she spoke up. "James, it's been a while. What's going on?" "I can't explain over the phone," James said, dropping his voice. "But I have something huge. Something that is worth telling. Can we meet?" Emily hesitated, then sighed. "All right, I'll meet you at the diner on Main Street in an hour." James ended the call and faced Mark. "We have our shot. We need to be careful." Mark nodded. "Let's make sure we have everything. No loose ends." An hour later, James and Mark arrived at the diner with the smell of coffee and fried food. Emily was sitting in a booth by the window, dark hair swept back in a tight ponytail, eyes wide and alert. "James?" she said coolly, the slightest of smiles. "I heard you were serious on the phone. What's this about?" James pushed the folder across the table. "It's about Eleanor Thompson, and what actually happened to her." Emily's eyes were dragged wide every time she flicked the pages, apparently in lightning speed. This is insane. If this is true, it's going to blow everything wide open." "It's all real," Mark leaned in. "We have more, but we need your help to make sure it gets out." Emily let out a breath, massaging her temple. "This is going to rub a lot of people the wrong way, James. Are you sure you're ready for that?" James looked over at Max, who was patiently lying beside him. "I don't think we have a choice anymore." Emily got the story after some back and forth. She said she would speak to her contacts and begin working on it and getting it verified with official sources. "Give me 48 hours, she said, rising to her feet. "I'll see to it that this gets to the light of day." James nodded and shook her hand. "Thanks, Emily. We owe you." When James walked out of the diner, he felt an odd sense of relief and unease at the same time. They were charging forward, but the stakes were higher than ever. Mark sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Now, it's a waiting game to see what happens." James looked down at Max, who wagged his tail reassuringly. "We'll see it through, no matter what. Although the truth is a strong thing, it comes with a cost." 2 days had gone by since I spoke with Emily, and the air was taut with tension. James caught himself looking over his shoulder and felt a nagging sense of unease deep in his chest. Max, always watchful, seldom left his side. Mark waited impatiently at the kitchen table, tapping his fingers on the wood. We would have heard something by now. James sighed. "Emily said 48 hours. We have to trust her." At that moment, James's phone buzzed. He picked it up and his heart raced when he saw the name on the screen. "Emily." "Emily," he answered quickly. Her voice was hushed, urgent. "James, I need you to come meet me. Now, something's wrong." James caught Mark's eye. "Where?" "The old train station. Come alone, and hurry." The call ended abruptly. James pulled into the parking lot of the abandoned train station, hands clutching the steering wheel tightly. The area was eerily silent, the wind blowing through the scattered broken windows, rusted railings. Mark had insisted on tagging along, but James had made him stay in the car just to be safe. Emily emerged from the shadows, her eyes flicking nervously about. She was holding a thick manila envelope pressed against her chest. "What's going on?" James asked, stepping closer. Emily passed him the envelope. "I brought this to my editor, but something's not right. He told me to drop it. Then I saw a car tailing me all the way." James went through the envelope. Inside were photocopies of the ledgers, Eleanor's journal, and a new document, the official deed transfer, signed under suspicious circumstances. "This shows Harold was moving money in fake land deals," Emily whispered. "James, you're in danger. If they know I have this, they know you have it too." James clenched his jaw. "Then we can't back down. We'll have to go public another way." All at once, a car slammed to a stop at the other end of the lot. Emily gasped, stepping back. "Go!" she urged. "Take it and go!" James didn't hesitate. He spun and sprinted to the car, jumping in and peeling out of the lot as headlights flickered behind him. "What happened?" "What are we doing?" Mark asked, as James shifted the car into drive. James threw down the envelope to the seat. "They know. We have to move fast." Max sensed our urgency and barked from the back seat. "Where to?" Mark asked. James thought quickly. "There's some safe place where we can lay low and figure out what we do next. We can't return to the house." Mark nodded. "There's a place a bit out of town," he said. "A cabin my uncle used to own. It's the perfect place to hide because no one will think to look for us there." James gripped the wheel harder. "Let's go." As they drove away from the train station, James looked in the rearview mirror. The car that had trailed them earlier was no longer behind them, but he knew it wouldn't be that way for much longer. It was a small cabin out in the middle of the woods. A small sigh of relief escaped James as they reached the long dirt driveway. Max jumped out first, cautiously sniffing the air. The cabin was dusty inside but intact. Mark locked the doors and windows, and James riffled through the documents on the kitchen table. "We need to get this out in front of us before we can never speak about it," James said insistently. Mark nodded. "Then let's figure out how." James stared at Max, who was lying next to the table with his eyes wide. "We're not giving up now," James said softly. "Not when we're this close. The truth will come out at any cost." James walked back and forth across the cabin floor, his mind spinning. Part of Mark sat at the little kitchen table, preparing these papers that were all over, while another part of him lay at the door, his ears jumping at every noise outside. "We need a solid plan," James said, raking his hands through his hair. "We can't sit here forever." Mark glanced up. "I say we go big. Get this story in front of the people who can do something about it quickly. No waiting around." James nodded and went for his phone. "Emily's out of play, but I know someone else. A national news organization that won't be intimidated." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You think they'll take it?" James clenched his jaw. "When they see what we've got, they aren't going to have a choice." James picked up the phone and dialed, his heart racing. A woman picked up after a few rings. "This is Rachel Turner, investigative reporting." "Who is this?" "Rachel, it's James Carter. I have a story you're going to want to hear. Deep corruption scandal, and I have proof. But we're in danger. We need to get this out, now." Rachel paused for a moment. "All right, James. Join me at the old diner outside Maplewood in an hour. Come alone." James hung up, looking at Mark. "It's happening. We're going public." When James arrived, the diner was nearly empty. Rachel was sitting in a booth toward the back, her piercing eyes sweeping the room. James took the seat opposite her and laid the envelope down on the table. "This has everything," he said. "The phony transactions, Eleanor's letters, and the secret safe in the house. Harold Thompson covered it all up." Rachel leafed through the documents, her demeanor growing grimmer with each page she turned. "This is solid. We can run with it. But James, if this goes live, you know they won't come after you." James nodded. "I'm ready. It's time." Rachel tucked the envelope into her bag. "I'll put this on the air tonight. Be ready for fallout." Back at the cabin, James and Mark sat watching the news anxiously. The segment ran, exposing the scandal to the public. Harold Thompson's face appeared on the screen, alongside Eleanor's story and the damning evidence they had gathered. James exhaled. "We did it." Mark slapped him on the shoulder. "Now we wait." Max wagged his tail, feeling their relief, but they all knew the fight was far from finished. The truth will set you free, but first, it will shake your world. James sat on the old couch in the cabin, staring at the TV as news anchors continued to talk about the scandal that had shaken the town of Maplewood. There was fear in his heart, but mingled with it was an undeniable relief. Mark walked back and forth in the room, looking at his phone every few minutes. "It's everywhere now, James. Social media, national news, even local radio stations are covering it. Harold Thompson is finished." James nodded slowly. "It still feels unreal. We actually did it." Max, sensing the change in the air, nudged James's hand with his nose, offering his companionship in silence. James smiled and patted his faithful sidekick. "Couldn't have done it without you, pal." Hours after the broadcast, police opened a formal investigation into Harold Thompson and his associates. High-profile arrests followed, and hidden bank accounts associated with the Thompson estate were frozen. As the facts came out, shock and outrage rippled through the town. Later that night, Emily called James. There was relief in her voice. "James, you're a hero. The town deserves to know the truth of what happened, and now with you, they finally do." James shook his head. "It wasn't just me, Emily. Eleanor left us the pieces. We just put them together." 1 week later, James and Mark stood outside the old Thompson estate. The house that used to be packed with secrets and whispers was now silent and empty. He held the journal in his hands. The parts were torn and familiar. "She deserved better," James said, tearing up. "But at least her story's been told now." Mark nodded. "And you made sure of that." James went to the old oak in the backyard, the spot where Max always tended to linger. He knelt and tucked the journal under the roots, adding a dusting of soil. "Rest easy, Eleanor," he muttered. Max lay next to him, tail slowly wagging, as if to say goodbye himself. James had a neat sense of purpose as they left the estate behind. The burden he had borne since he'd found the basement safe was finally lifting. "So, what's next for you?" Mark said, looking at James. He smiled as he scratched Max behind the ears. "I feel like it's time for a new beginning. Somewhere new, just Max and me." Mark grinned. "Sounds like a plan." And as the car disappeared down the snaky road, he felt peace for the first time in ages. The past had finally been vanquished, and the future was untethered. Max's head leaned slightly against James's shoulder, gazing up at him with absolute loyalty. "Let's see what the road will give us, buddy." A few months later, James moved to a small town far away from Maplewood. He opened a small repair shop, retreating to the comforts of simpler things. Max stayed with him, a constant reminder of the paths they traveled. And whenever he did, James would look over at the framed photo of Eleanor and Max's predecessor, knowing they had finally received justice. And sometimes the greatest adventures start with the truth. The end.